Good afternoon, Danvers. Welcome to the Topics of the Town presentation of a special report that I have been working on with Mr. Richard Trask in regard to the history and development of Danvers population, Danvers politics, and Danvers' location and relationship to the other communities in the New England or North Shore area. Today, what I'm presenting to you is a first installment or first part of a multi-part presentation of conversations that I've conducted with Mr. Richard Trask, who is our archivist, and he is our elder statesman in the town, and he knows more history than I could ever remember. Discussions with Mr. Trask were very, very productive, and you'll see the installments that are going to be coming your way. And what I'm trying to do is give you a short 30 to 35 minute segments so you can digest and understand what we're up to. So today I am trying to introduce this as a series of segments or installments. Topics of the Town will be presenting this special report, which I am entitling Danvers History with Richard Trask, our archivist. And he has been our archivist and our historian basically for longer than I have been in this town. But he's one of the townies. This will be a multi-part presentation of Danvers history as narrated by Richard Trask and produced by myself, Mark Zuberek, with support of DCAT and the facilities that we're using. So thank you to all, and I hope you enjoy this. This will be the first part, and this will be an introduction to Mr. Trask and to the early days of Danvers as a colony of the British government. Thank you, and enjoy the little presentation, and you'll see where I'm going with this. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, today this is Mark Zuberek, and I'm here today with Richard Trask, and I am going to present to you Conversations with Richard Trask, our town archivist, and this would be our introduction to the show. What I want to present to the audience is, who is Richard Trask? And he just smiles, but he needs to introduce himself because not many people know who you are and what you do and how long you've been around here. So what I'm going to ask Richard to give us a little dissertation on he is the current Danvers town archivist, current elder statesman, and he laughed a little bit about that, but I recognize that as an elder statesman because you've been with town meeting for many years more than I have, and we have communicated at town meeting all the time. Current Danvers lifelong resident. You've lived in Danvers forever, and your family has gone back to the like I called it earlier to Richard, is we both came on the boat, but it all depends on which boat. So, the current Danvers published author, that's our Richard Trask as well. And what we'll like to do is go into some highlights of your publications. And the question before us, and what I'd like to have you present to us, who is Richard Trask? And the thing is that it's very important, so here you go. Here's your opportunity to give us a rundown of who is Richard Trask.
I've been trying to figure that out for decades. And I have to admit, yeah, I am one of the senior members of Danvers Town Meeting, but I'm not as old as Bill Clark. Bill Clark beats me, I think, by a year. Mm-hmm. And both of us ran for town meeting when we were 21. That was the age back then for voting. And Bill beat me because he's a year older than me. But I think he and I are now, with a lot of our friends who have died off and so forth, two of the oldest members of town meeting.
Well, that gives you some privileges.
Yeah.
So if you can give us a rundown of, when I mentioned the boats, where and when did the family of Trasks begin? Do they still carry on the tradition of self-government? And the question I had is, did you come on the Mayflower? And or were your family members initially on the colonies?
Well, you know, every family can trace their ancestry back, sometimes only for a few generations, sometimes for a huge amount of generations, going back to the 1500s or 1600s. And part of my family, my father's side, does go back a long way. And as a matter of fact, the Trask name goes back to the actual first settlers of Salem and what became Danvers. There was a guy named William Trask who was a captain in the local militia, and he was one of the people who came over with John Endicott in the late 1620s. And so that part of the family is pretty stable. My mother is of French descendants, and her part of the family, we don't go back that far on. And like every family in America, it's a mixed bag of people who relatively recently immigrated and people who have been here for centuries. I like to dwell sometimes on the older ancestors because so what happens with every family is, you know, we all have parents, and then we have 4 grandparents, and then for great-grandparents we'll have 8, and for great-great-grandparents we'll have 16, and it just goes in multiples. So you have a lot of stories and a lot of dead ends when people can't trace anyone back as far as they want to. And luckily in our family we have about 6 or 7 different lines that we can bring back to the 17th and sometimes to the 16th and even the 15th century, which is kind of neat, kind of fun. So I've been a resident of Danvers since my birth, although I never like to mention it, but I was actually born at Beverly Hospital. But since then I've never left Essex County in Danvers except for a few trips. So I consider myself to be kind of a townie. As I was growing up, I knew from my grandparents that I had one of the witchcraft victims in my ancestry. And since then, I discovered that actually I have about 7 of them. 2 who were hanged and a number of them put in jail. And then one of my nephews did a little genealogical research, and I always wondered if we go back not in Essex County but in Plymouth County, and we were able to find out that I'm actually related to one of the passengers of the Mayflower. And that was kind of a fun thing. And me, the historian, never found that out, but my nephew did. And that just gives you kind of a
Perspective.
a feel and perspective for, what's happened. And, you can have some real rogues or some famous and heroic people in your family, but of course that doesn't reflect upon you. But it also makes life a little more interesting when you find out who your ancestry is. And I can remember back in the 80s, that there was a TV program that caught the nation, which was called Roots, about black slaves who had come, not wanting to this country. And that opened up the idea of genealogy. And since then, everybody's interested, because people are interested in themselves and also the people who came before them. And I'm sure some of you have watched the program on PBS, in which Professor Gates talks sometimes to famous people, and they find out who their ancestry is. So it's always fun to talk about yourself and your family and your way back family. And that's been one of the things that I've been working in the Danvers Archival Center since it was founded back in 1972. And probably about almost 50% of the people who visit or contact us want to know something about their ancestors. And luckily for us, the town of Danvers, formerly Salem Village, always kept records. Puritans and Yankees always kept records. And unless you have a major flood or a bad fire, most of these records are still in town clerks' offices and historical societies and other places, as well as family records. And what we've done in the archives is basically put all of that material together that deals with people from multi-generations who have lived in this area. Unfortunately, we can't do much about the Aboriginal who are here, although we do have good traditions about many of them. Artifacts that have been unearthed for centuries. Although, an artifact is only as good as what it was made out of. So we have a fine collection of arrowheads, hatchets, and adzes that go back, in some cases, as much as 4,000 years. Unfortunately, they didn't write history, so much of it we have to really find different ways of approaching things. And I've always loved history. I don't know why. My parents weren't really big in history, but I always loved the idea of being able to see what it was like in the past. And that's given me a pretty satisfying life of inquiring into the past and finding out who was around, what they did, and why they maybe did those things.
Richard, the question a lot of times comes up, how extensive was the colony of Salem Village, I guess, that made up Salem, Peabody, and Danvers? How extensive was the population at that time?
Well, it obviously depends upon what time you're talking about. Everybody knows about the Pilgrims, who were actually calling themselves separatists.
Right.
They originally were living in England. Many of them believed that the Anglican Church that they were under was still too papist, too Catholic, and they wanted to purify the Church of England. And a number of them went to Europe for a period of time, and then it was decided to see if they could come to the New World and set up a city upon the hill. And they were very proselytizing, they were very sure of their religious values, and wanted to separate from what they thought were the smackings of irreligious Anglicans and Catholics. So they made an agreement, a commercial agreement, to be able to come to this country, and they did. And everybody knows about the Pilgrims, 1620. Anytime I used to go to Virginia, you know, Virginia was settled in 1607, so they're the first. But they have a deep resentment of Plymouth and the Pilgrims, because everybody knows about the Pilgrims because of Thanksgiving. And 1607 gets short shrift around here, and to many of the population who just doesn't know an awful lot about history. And they settled in Plymouth and the communities that they established around Plymouth Plantation. And they were a separate colony, and they remained separate until 1692, when they were merged with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts now was actually first settled by a lot of fishermen who used to come from England to take the wonderful products of the sea, and would have little stations in places like what became Gloucester to take the cod and other things that they had. But they never settled here. It wasn't until about 1628 that the first Puritans came to the New World. And separatists were a little different than the Puritans. The Puritans were another religious group, and in those days you had huge amounts of different religious groups. And the Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, which they also thought was too Catholic, and they wanted to establish a place for themselves. And some merchants in England decided to set up some companies, and the Puritans became some of the directors of these companies, but also they saw that this would be a good means of them getting some money for backup to be able to come to the New World and set up their kingdom upon the hill, in which they could do things the way they wanted. And they did so. And in 1628, John Endicott, who lived in what's now Danvers for a number of years, although he also settled in Boston, he and about 50 other adventurers, almost all Puritans, came to this area in 1628 and established on a Indian site called Nomacake a settlement. And that settlement eventually became known as Salem, an offshoot of the word shalom for peace. And they thrived, especially about 1630, when a number of ships coming from England came to Salem. They stayed there, and they kind of looked around to see if there was a better place than Salem, and they eventually went to what's now Boston. And those people, with John Winthrop in charge, settled the town of Boston, which became eventually the capital of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the peculiar thing about the Puritans who settled in this area was they were always given a patent. And the patent was basically an economic agreement that they would establish in the New World. But the patent also allowed them, like most companies have bylaws now, bylaws which establish them to be able to do things. And in fact, having the charter in the New World and being able to establish the company, the Puritans kind of wrangled it around so that they took that on as being their own kind of constitution. And almost from the beginning, the people who settled in New England looked upon themselves as being good, loyal subjects of the King of England, but with a different religious bent, with a commerce that was supposed to send stuff from this country that was very worthwhile in the old, fish, timber, things like that, and establish themselves to be somewhat semi-independent and kind of autonomous from the old world. And that was a tradition that stayed for years and years up to the Revolution and beyond.
So the town charter or the state charter or the colony charter is one and the same document that they've used over the years. So this is prehistoric document that governs us, and like you said, Constitution, that's exactly what it does. It spells out all of the yeses and nos.
Yeah, it started pretty fragmentary,
Right.
and it did develop. It evolved into that kind of thing, and New Englanders, usually in the early years, kind of separate from the Church of England, and also having a real independent streak, which they promulgated at any point, came to be what we would look at the time of the Revolution, of people who wanted to be part of England, but also take care of their own goods and their own government. One of my favorite people at the time of the beginning of the Revolution is a 19-year-old kid named Levi Preston, who was a Minuteman who marched to Lexington and Concord. Actually didn't get there, and years later, on the 50th anniversary of April 1775, he was interviewed, and he was asked, why did you want to break from your mother country? Was it that you had read the writings of John Locke and some of the other philosophers of that time? And he said, John Locke, we never heard of that guy. What we had for books was the Bible. So it wasn't that. Well, was it because you didn't like the after the Tea Party, in which the American Indians threw tea into Boston Harbor? Was it because of tea? Tea, I never drank the stuff. I was a person who drank cider, and the better, the hotter the cider, the better. Well, what was it that made you want to break from the mother country? Well, he said, young man, the reason we did this was we had always been free, and we meant to be free always. And that pretty much puts it in a nutshell of why the Revolution began. Every other colony has its own origin stories, and they're not better or worse than New England, but New England had a real streak of wanting to be independent. Sometimes it was because economically they didn't want to pay taxes. They didn't want to have Parliament tell them what to do. Town meeting did that. And New England is pretty peculiar in having town meeting. It's one of the few institutions in the world that came pretty close much of the time to sovereign independence of people. And that's one of the things that kind of caused the American Revolution.
It was the independence of individuals that created the impetus for the revolution as well.
Yeah. And it, it also was economic. The upper class didn't like to pay taxes.
Well, we still don't like to pay taxes.
People like John Hancock took advantage and tried to stay away from any taxation for importing stuff and importing stuff not from England. So it's a mixed bag, but within that terribly mixed bag, you have a real thread of people wanting to be independent and make decisions for themselves.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. However, what I want to do is I want to thread this thing through to the next part, which is really what I am trying to get across is colonial government through the Independence Day. And independence was in 1776. And what we will try to do in part one, which will be the next part that we'll be dealing with, is how the government transitioned from colonial town meeting to the Revolutionary War town meeting, because that's when people took control of their own destiny at that time. And they said, enough is enough, we're going in this direction. So what I like to do is, this will be part of the introduction, and what I want to do is transition to part one, which will be colonial government through the independence in 1776. So we'll work on the town meeting government and whatever the town charter was at that time, and that's what we'd like to do. So thank you, and be in anticipation of part one coming up, and thank you very much, Nick, for being here, because you are part of the cog of this wheel, and it seems to be rotating from the Mayflower till now. And we'll talk about that next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.